On April 7, 1945, at dawn over Tokyo Bay in the Empire of Japan, a formation of 91 North American P-51D Mustangs from the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups approached their designated rendezvous point. Major James B. Tapp maintained control of his Mustang, armed with 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The early model P-51Ds carried 500 rounds for each inboard gun and 270 rounds for the center and outboard positions, totaling 2,880 rounds. Later variants would reduce the inboard gun capacity to 400 rounds for improved reliability, bringing the total ammunition load to 1,880 rounds. Below the formation, Mount Fuji rose distinctly against the clear morning sky, its snow-capped peak serving as a crucial navigation reference point throughout the mission. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Japanese countryside, illuminating a patchwork landscape of rice fields, villages, and military installations that had never before witnessed American fighters overhead. This mission represented an unprecedented achievement in military aviation, escorting B-29 superfortresses deep into the Japanese homeland from a base located 750 miles away. This distance had been deemed impossible for single-engine fighters by military planners just 2 years earlier. At 0700 hours, more than 100 Japanese interceptors converged on the American formation. Through the morning haze, Japanese pilots witnessed a sight that shocked them profoundly. Single-engine American fighters over Tokyo. Their commanders had repeatedly assured them this was impossible. The psychological impact proved immediate and devastating. These were not carrier-based Navy fighters with inherently limited range, but land-based Army Air Force fighters that had somehow crossed 750 miles of open ocean to appear over the imperial capital. The Japanese defense consisted of pilots flying various aircraft types, including the Nakajima K-84 Hayate, designated Frank by Allied forces, Japan's fastest and most advanced fighter, alongside older K-43 Hayabusas, K-44 Shokis, K-61 Hien, and Navy aircraft including A-6M0s and N-1K2J Shiden Kais. The K-84 possessed the capability to outclimb and outmaneuver both the P-51 and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt at certain altitudes and speeds. The ensuing engagement would demonstrate the vast technological gulf between two nations' approaches to air warfare and reveal why American industrial might had produced what many pilots would call the perfect long-range fighter aircraft. The P-51D Mustang, Engineering Excellence. The North American P-51D Mustang arrived in the Pacific Theater with a reputation already established in the skies over Europe, where it had significantly degraded Luftwaffe capabilities and made daylight bombing of Germany feasible. Initially developed for export to Britain, the aircraft underwent a transformative modification when the British adapted it to use Rolls-Royce Whirlin engines, creating America's most capable wartime fighter. This transformation from Allison-powered early variants to the Merlin-powered masterpiece represented one of aviation history's most successful international collaborations, combining American aerodynamic innovation with British engine technology. The combination of the legendary Merlin engine and the P-51 Mustang airframe eventually produced the P-51D, which provided the U.S. Army Air Forces with a high-performance, high-altitude, long-range fighter capable of escorting heavy bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back, and now, incredibly, from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back. The Packard V1650-7 engine, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, delivered 1,695 horsepower at takeoff with water injection, rising to 1,720 horsepower in emergency war power settings. This two-stage, two-speed supercharged power plant maintained high performance at altitudes where Japanese engines struggled significantly, as their single-stage superchargers proved unable to compress the thin atmosphere sufficiently. The P-51D achieved a maximum speed of approximately 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet and reached an operating ceiling of almost 42,000 feet and was armed with 6 wing-mounted .50-inch M2 Browning machine guns. The firepower mathematics were devastating and precisely calculated. 6 M2 Browning machine guns firing at 800 rounds per minute each meant the P-51D could deliver 4,800 rounds of concentrated firepower, equivalent to 80 rounds per second. Each armor-piercing incendiary round weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering tremendous kinetic energy on impact, capable of penetrating aircraft armor, igniting fuel tanks, and destroying engines with just a few well-placed hits. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter squadrons of the U.S. 8th Air Force in Europe were composed of Mustangs, demonstrating the aircraft's superiority over all other available fighters. This massive production and deployment reflected American industrial capacity at its peak, with assembly lines running continuously. North American aviation factories in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas produced Mustangs at an extraordinary rate. At peak production, a new Mustang rolled off the assembly line every hour. By war's end, 15,586 P-51s of all variants were manufactured, with the D model alone accounting for 8,156 aircraft, more than Japan's total production of all fighter types in the last 2 years of the war combined. Revolutionary range capability. The very long-range capability that brought Mustangs to Tokyo represented a revolution in fighter operations that fundamentally changed air warfare mathematics. With dual 110-gallon drop tanks, Mustangs could routinely fly round trips of 1,500 statute miles, though pilots would push this to 1,600 miles when necessary. This was equivalent to flying from Los Angeles to Little Rock, Arkansas, entirely over water in a single-engine aircraft with no alternate landing sites except the ocean. The key to this achievement lay in the Merlin engine's exceptional fuel efficiency at cruise settings, consuming just 65 gallons per hour at economical cruise, combined with the P-51's laminar flow wing design that reduced drag by 35% compared to conventional airfoils. The laminar flow wing, developed by North American's aerodynamicist Edgar Schmud, maintained smooth airflow over a greater percentage of the wing surface, delaying the transition to turbulent flow and dramatically reduced parasitic drag. The Japanese K-84 Hayate, promising design, compromised reality. Standing in contrast was the Nakajima K-84 Hayate, which entered operational service with the Imperial Japanese Air Service in June 1944, too late and in insufficient numbers to affect the war's outcome. Named Gale and designated by the Allies as Frank, this fighter represented Japan's desperate attempt to match American technological superiority with remaining resources.
The K-84 is generally considered the best Japanese fighter to operate in large numbers during the conflict, though large numbers remained relative. What Japan considered mass production, America would consider prototype runs. The aircraft featured high speed and excellent maneuverability, with an armament of up to two 30mm Ho-155 cannons and two 20mm Ho-5 cannons, providing formidable firepower on paper. However, the reality proved more complex. The 30mm cannons carried only 50 rounds per gun, while the 20mm cannons held just 150 rounds per gun, giving a total ammunition load of only 400 rounds compared to the Mustang's 1,880 to 2,880 rounds. The aircraft was powered by the Nakajima Ha-45 Homare 18-cylinder radial engine, a complex piece of machinery with fuel injection and a single-stage 2-speed supercharger using water methanol injection. The engine was rated at 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. Initial testing showed promise, with prototypes reaching 387 miles per hour in level flight and later claims of up to 427 miles per hour under ideal conditions with high-octane fuel and perfect engine tuning. However, the reality of late-war Japanese production told a dramatically different story of declining quality, desperate improvisation, and systemic failure. Pilots and ground crews discovered they needed to exercise extreme care with the plane's high-maintenance Nakajima Homare engine and landing gear, prone to buckling at critical moments. The Homare engine, while theoretically powerful and advanced, suffered from chronic reliability problems that worsened as quality control collapsed. The engine required precise tolerances that Japanese factories, under constant B-29 bombardment and lacking quality steel and aluminum, could no longer maintain. Many landing gear units were compromised by poor quality heat treatment of late-war Japanese steel, often containing impurities that made proper hardening impossible. As a result, many Hayates suffered strut collapses on landing, destroying aircraft that Japan could not afford to lose and killing pilots whose training had taken months. Industrial capacity and quality control. The disparity in production quality reflected the broader industrial crisis facing Japan, a nation that had gambled everything on a short war and lost. While American factories maintained consistent quality standards despite massive production volumes, actually improving quality as production techniques were refined, Japanese manufacturing deteriorated precipitously. Progressive deterioration in quality control meant that pilots never knew how individual aircraft would perform, whether the brakes would work, whether the engine would hold together at high power settings, or even whether they would be able to climb high enough to intercept B-29 superfortresses cruising at 30,000 feet. By 1945, Japan had produced only 3,513 K-84s total, and many of these were grounded due to lack of spare parts, fuel, or qualified pilots. Of those that were operational, perhaps half could be considered truly combat-ready at any given time. The fuel crisis. The fuel situation alone revealed the strategic catastrophe facing Japan, a nation that had gone to war partly to secure oil resources. While American pilots flew with 100-octane aviation gasoline shipped from refineries in Texas and California, fuel specifically formulated for high-performance engines, Japanese pilots made do with whatever could be produced domestically or synthesized from coal. Late-war Japanese aviation fuel often tested at 87 octane or lower, sometimes as low as 80 octane, robbing engines of power and causing pre-ignition that destroyed cylinders, pistons, and valves. Some desperate units attempted to supplement their fuel with pine root oil extracted from pine stumps, alcohol distilled from sweet potatoes, and even sake production byproducts, further degrading engine performance and reliability. Pilots reported engines that would barely start, ran rough at all power settings, and often failed catastrophically in flight. The April 7th mission, on that first April 7th mission, the Mustangs formed up with their charges, 103 Boeing B-29 superfortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing, each carrying tons of incendiary bombs destined for Japanese industrial targets. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Fighter Squadron described the scene as a real spectacle, with the B-29s finishing their assembly in a grand circle as the fighters arrived. The sun glinted off their aluminum skin, and they appeared like a school of giant silver fish swimming through the sky. The rendezvous itself represented a triumph of navigation and planning that would have been impossible without American technological advantages. The P-51s had flown 750 miles over open ocean, navigating primarily by dead reckoning and basic radio compass, timing their arrival to the bomber's schedule within minutes. They had climbed gradually from sea level to 25,000 feet, their engines automatically adjusting mixture as they climbed, their superchargers seamlessly transitioning from low blower to high blower to maintain power. Crossing the coast of Honshu, the P-51 pilots dropped their 110-gallon auxiliary wing tanks as they began to spot the first head-on feints from a force of more than 100 Japanese interceptors scrambling from multiple airfields around Tokyo. The silver drop tanks tumbled earthward, glinting in the morning sun, some exploding as they hit the ground, others bouncing across rice paddies. The Japanese pilots, flying a mixed force of K-84s, K-44s, K-43s, K-61s, and Navy fighters including Zeros and the new N-1K2J Shiden Kai, experienced their first shock. These were not Navy carrier fighters with limited range, but land-based fighters that had somehow reached the homeland from bases they knew were impossibly distant. Flight Sergeant Tota Nizumu, flying a K-84 with the 56th Sentai, later recalled his disbelief upon being scrambled and told enemy fighters were approaching Tokyo. He initially thought it must be a mistake, perhaps referring to enemy bombers. When he saw the Mustangs with his own eyes, he thought he was dreaming. It seemed impossible. Their commanders had assured them that no Japanese fighter could reach Japan from their island bases, yet there they were, dozens of them, flying as if they owned the sky. In that moment, he realized the war was lost.
Major James B. Tapp, who would later become an ace with 8 confirmed victories, was among the first Mustang pilots to engage a formation of Japanese fighters. His combat report, written hours after the mission, described the engagement with clinical precision. The Japanese came at them in the traditional 3-plane shotai formation, but their coordination was poor. The flight leader would commit to an attack, but his wingmen often failed to follow through. They seemed hesitant, perhaps low on fuel or ammunition, or simply inexperienced. The American pilots dove through them with a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, fired quick bursts, and zoom climbed back to altitude before the Japanese pilots could react. This breakdown in Japanese tactical coordination reflected the crisis in pilot training that had reached catastrophic proportions. By 1945, most experienced Japanese pilots were dead, killed over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, or in the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Replacements received as little as 50 hours of flight training before being thrown into combat, compared to the 600 hours American pilots received before deploying to combat theaters. When the smoke cleared and the Mustangs returned to their Iwo Jima base, the Sunsetters of 7th Fighter Command were credited with 26 Japanese planes destroyed, 1 probable and 5 damaged, at a cost of 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. The 13-to-1 kill ratio on this first mission would only improve as American pilots gained experience over Japan and Japanese pilot quality continued to deteriorate. Within weeks, kill ratios of 20-to-1 or even 30-to-1 would become common, reflecting not just American superiority, but Japanese desperation. Performance differential in combat. The performance differential between the aircraft became starkly apparent in combat, particularly in the vertical dimension, where air combat was increasingly fought. The P-51D's superiority was particularly evident above 20,000 feet, the altitude where most interceptions took place. At these altitudes, the Merlin engine's 2-stage supercharger maintained sea-level power, while Japanese engines struggled for breath. The first stage compressed the thin air, cooled it through an intercooler, then fed it to the second stage for further compression, delivering dense, oxygen-rich air to the cylinders. The K-84's single-stage supercharger, lacking an intercooler in second stage, caused power to drop off dramatically above 20,000 feet, reducing its speed advantage and climb rate precisely where most interceptions occurred. At 30,000 feet, the K-84 could barely maintain 350 miles per hour, while the P-51D could still achieve 420 miles per hour. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen of the 78th Fighter Squadron, who would fly the last combat mission of the war on August 14, 1945, August 15th in Japan, described a typical engagement with vivid detail. American pilots would spot Japanese fighters climbing up to meet them, leaving dark exhaust trails as they advanced their throttles to maximum power. But by 25,000 feet, the Japanese aircraft were struggling significantly. Their engines were smoking, probably running too rich because their superchargers couldn't provide enough air. The American pilots would dive through their formation with their .50 caliber guns firing, the tracers appearing like laser beams, and the Japanese pilots simply couldn't match their speed in the dive or their zoom climb afterward. The Merlin engines would sing as the American pilots pulled up, G-forces crushing them into their seats, while the Japanese radials would cough and sputter, struggling to maintain power. The P-51D could dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour while maintaining control authority, its laminar flow wings remaining effective even in the transonic regime, whereas Japanese fighters often experienced control reversal or structural failure at speeds above 400 miles per hour in a dive, their control surfaces blanking out, or their wings simply tearing off. Pilot training disparity. The contrast in pilot quality was devastating and grew worse with each passing day. American pilots arriving at Iwo Jima typically had 400 to 600 hours of flight time, including 100-plus hours in type, dozens of hours of gunnery practice, and extensive combat training against experienced instructors flying captured enemy aircraft or accurate simulations. They had practiced formation flying until it became second nature, instrument navigation in all weather conditions, deflection shooting at towed targets, and combat tactics developed from 3 years of air warfare experience. Japanese pilots in 1945 often had less than 100 hours total time, sometimes as little as 30 hours, with minimal gunnery practice due to ammunition shortages, no instrument training, and combat tactics learned from manuals rather than experienced instructors who were all dead or flying combat missions themselves. Navigation and support systems. The navigation challenge alone separated the capable from the doomed. Flying single-engine fighters on 1,500-mile round trips over a vast ocean with minimal navigation aids required confidence born of experience and trust in both machine and support systems. American pilots flew with detailed weather briefings compiled from submarine weather reports and reconnaissance flights, accurate maps updated from photo recon, and functioning instruments manufactured to precise specifications. They had rescue submarines stationed along their route, Lifeguard League submarines that saved dozens of downed airmen, and could rely on Dumbo PBI flying boats to rescue them if forced down. Japanese pilots increasingly flew with outdated maps that didn't show recent bomb damage, unreliable compasses that hadn't been properly calibrated, and no hope of rescue if downed over water. Their life rafts, if they had them at all, often leaked, and their emergency rations had usually been consumed during food shortages on the ground. The magnetic variation between Iwo Jima and Tokyo in 1945 was 3 degrees west, since Tokyo lay between the 130th and 140th meridians, while Iwo Jima was between the 141st and 142nd. Navigation was simplified to basic compass headings for the return flight, a fortunate geographic coincidence that saved many American lives. This geographic coincidence proved crucial when weather deteriorated or pilots became disoriented in combat, their compasses spinning wildly as they maneuvered. A pilot could simply fly south-southeast and know he would eventually see Iwo Jima's distinctive Mount Suribachi rising from the ocean, assuming he had enough fuel. Logistics and supply chain. The logistics supporting each force revealed the true nature of the Pacific Air War, a contest between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. Every mission from Iwo Jima involved nearly 90 Mustangs consuming 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and carrying 230,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, plus bombs and rockets for ground attack missions. This represented just 1 day's operations from one base, and there were 3 fighter groups operating from Iwo Jima alone. Behind this stood a supply chain stretching back to factories in Detroit, refineries in Texas, and ammunition plants in Missouri, all connected by Liberty ships produced at a rate of 3 per day and C-54 Skytrain transport aircraft that flew regular cargo routes across the Pacific. Ships arrived at Iwo Jima daily, unloading fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, mail, and the 1,000 other items needed to keep a modern air force operational. Meanwhile, Japanese logistics had collapsed into chaos and desperation. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were canceled, leaving new pilots to face combat with no recent flying experience. Ammunition was rationed even for combat missions, with pilots told to conserve rounds for only the most certain shots. The Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, never well coordinated even in the best of times, now competed desperately for dwindling resources. Aircraft were cannibalized for spare parts until they were nothing but aluminum skeletons, and entire fighter groups were grounded for lack of tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid. Some units attempted to manufacture their own spare parts in primitive workshops with predictably poor results. Technological sophistication gap. The technological sophistication gap extended beyond the aircraft themselves to every aspect of operations. American pilots wore G-suits that prevented blackouts in high G maneuvers by squeezing blood back to the brain, used standardized oxygen systems that functioned reliably above 30,000 feet with automatic flow regulation, and communicated via VHF radios with clear reception and multiple channels. Their parachutes were regularly inspected and repacked. Their life rafts contained working radios and fresh supplies, and their survival kits included everything from morphine to fishing gear. Japanese pilots flew without functioning radios, as their vacuum tube radios consumed precious battery power and rarely worked properly. They used unreliable oxygen systems that frequently failed above 20,000 feet, leading to hypoxia and disorientation, and had no G-suits, limiting their ability to match American aggressive maneuvering without blacking out or suffering broken blood vessels in their eyes. Black Friday, June 1st, 1945, called Black Friday by the Mustang men, weather rather than enemy action proved the greatest threat, demonstrating that even American technology had limits. Approximately 150 Mustangs en route to Osaka flew into a blinding frontal system that wasn't supposed to be there according to weather forecasts. 27 aircraft were lost in minutes, with 24 losses due to weather, pilots becoming disoriented in towering cumulus clouds, flying into each other, or simply running out of fuel while trying to find clear air. This disaster illustrated that even for the technologically superior Americans, the very long-range missions pushed men and machines to their absolute limits. The weather front extended from sea level to 40,000 feet with violent turbulence, icing conditions, and zero visibility. Pilots reported St. Elmo's fire dancing on their wings, compasses spinning uselessly, and artificial horizons tumbling as their gyroscopes gave up trying to make sense of the violent motion. The impact on Japanese morale was catastrophic and irreversible. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a K-84 pilot with the 47th Sentai who survived the war, wrote in his diary that the appearance of American fighters over Tokyo had shattered their confidence completely. They had been told the B-29s were vulnerable without escort, that American fighters could never reach so far. Now they saw Mustangs over the palace itself, strafing their airfields in broad daylight, shooting down their best pilots as if they were beginners. The sight of those Mustangs with their invasion stripes, so confident and numerous, told them what their leaders would not. The war was lost, and they were simply waiting to die. Major Tapp stated in a post-war interview that VLR missions were a test of flying skill. Battling Japanese fighter pilots caused adrenaline to flow, but getting from point A to point B was the hardest part. The ocean was endless, featureless, hypnotic.
Pilots would check their compasses constantly, wondering if they were wrong, if they had somehow gotten turned around. The physical and mental strain was enormous and cumulative. Pilots stayed strapped into their cockpits for 8 hours or more, unable to stand, unable to stretch, unable to relieve themselves except into a relief tube that often froze at altitude. They dealt with cramping legs, numbed buttocks, and the constant anxiety of flying a single-engined aircraft over vast stretches of empty ocean where one mechanical failure meant almost certain death. Cockpit ergonomics. The Mustang's cockpit ergonomics, refined through 3 years of combat experience and thousands of pilot reports, proved superior to Japanese designs in every measurable way. The P-51D featured a bubble canopy, providing 360-degree visibility. Pilots could actually look behind them by turning their heads, a life-saving capability in combat. The seat was fully adjustable for pilots of different heights. The rudder pedals could be moved to accommodate different leg length, and controls were positioned for minimum pilot fatigue during long missions. The instrument panel was logically arranged, with the most important instruments, airspeed, altitude, engine gauges, directly in the pilot's line of sight. The K-84's cockpit, while an improvement to earlier Japanese fighters like the Zero, still suffered from poor visibility to the rear due to structural members and the fuel tank behind the pilot's head. Awkwardly placed controls that required pilots to take their hands off the stick at critical moments, and instruments that were difficult to read in combat conditions, especially when pulling Gs or when the vibration from the engine made everything blur. Armament comparison. Armament differences proved decisive in combat outcomes, often determining who lived and who died in the split-second encounters that characterized air combat. The P-51D's 0.5 caliber machine guns, while seeming less impressive than the K-84's mixed cannon armament, offered crucial advantages that combat experience had proven decisive.